It's funny. I came out here and I wanted to talk about something to do with the fear of inadequacy. And when I came out here, I was excited to talk about this. And the blue chair that I've been sitting in, the blue chair that when I moved away from where I was living in Florida, sold my van, came back here, and the one thing that I found was that blue chair. It washed away in a flood because it's rained over the past few nights. But the reason why it's funny is because the fear of inadequacy, what it's become for me is something more like an acceptance, a knowledge. And to say that you're afraid of inadequacy, to say that you're afraid of not being good enough, it's like you're fighting against it. But it's reached a point in my life that I've seen the I've seen that the way that I act just isn't good enough. And I don't mean that in a self-deprecating way, but more so the reason why it's funny that the blue chair floated away is because when you accept your inadequacies and when you accept your faults and accept that you are a person who is always being but also becoming, you open yourself up for a greater will. You open yourself up to surrender to God's will. And so the place that I was going to record this forced me to move here, and now I'm back to the floor where I began, sitting on a tree stump. And I think this is a more beautiful location. But I wouldn't have come here if the chair that I had, the one thing that was a light for me only a few weeks ago, wouldn't have floated away in the flood. So in regards to inadequacy, there's a story that I read, a person that I read about. It gives me encouragement when I find myself in a state of doubt. And it is the man who has the strangest relationship with God. It is the man who, relative to God, he receives an absurd amount of favor, an absurd amount of love in the most beautiful way from God. And it's interesting because we spoke about Job last week, and God allows Job to be tempted by Satan. God allows Satan to take away everything that Job holds dear, even things that are good, his family and his livelihood. But relative to this person, God protects him. God allows him to do miracles. God is always walking with him, and God shows him the most beautiful mercy. And it is Elijah. And Elijah, for me, if you read the Bible is many things. If you read it as though it were a novel, a story that somebody would have written, the whole thing being a hero's journey, the story of Elijah is like the apotheosis of the Old Testament. And the apotheosis is when something like a climax happens, something really dramatic happens. But despite the fact that something climatic and powerful has just occurred, the main character goes into a place that is even darker. Despite the fact that he just confronted what it was that he was supposed to confront and maybe accomplished what it was that he was supposed to do, he finds himself in the darkest place that he's ever been. And that happens for Elijah when Elijah lives in a time when the whole world is against God and they're worshiping false prophets. And God stands against, or Elijah rather, stands against kings and stands against all the false prophets. And there's a scene where Elijah brings fire down from heaven. God allows Elijah to bring fire down from heaven to reorient the world towards the one true God. And so he does this incredibly climactic, miraculous thing, but immediately after he does this climactic thing, he is chased off by the king's wife, essentially, and she wants him to have his life ended, so he retreats out into the wilderness. And he becomes incredibly desolate. He becomes like a broken man, desolate, and he struggles to recover. But it's unlike any story. I say like to read it like a novel and a hero's journey because it is that as well, but it's unlike any story that exists. And what I mean is that Elijah is in the wilderness and he's by himself. It's just him and God. And he's incredibly lonely, and God sends an angel to him as he's sleeping and wakes him up. And the angel says, Elijah, you need to, here is some food. Eat some of this food. You're going to need nutrients and energy for your journey. But the reason why the angel gives him food is because Elijah had just prayed to God that God would take his life. Elijah prayed to God that God would just take his life because Elijah can't bear it anymore. And so an angel brings some food to eat and says, you're going to need more nutrients and energy for your journey, so eat this food. So Elijah gets out of his sleep, eats the food, goes back to sleep, then wakes up and travels for 40 days. And that's when something incredibly beautiful happens, which is that Elijah remains desolate and weary and broken. And the angel comes to him once more and he's like, what's going on, Elijah? Why do you keep retreating? Why do you keep isolating yourself? What's going on? And Elijah says, I've had such zeal for God. I've done miracles and I've praised God, but the world is still against me, and the whole country is chasing me and they want to take my life, and I just can't take it anymore. And that's when the angel says, go stand on the cliff. You're going to watch the Lord as he passes by. And so Elijah goes to the cliff and he sees an earthquake, but God isn't in the earthquake, and he sees fire, but God isn't in the fire, and there's a really strong wind, but God isn't in the wind. But then after the wind, there's a gentle whisper of the wind. And when there's a gentle whisper in the wind, it doesn't say it explicitly, but Elijah covers his face. And part of the reason why I love this story so much is because the reason why he's covering his face is because God is in the gentle whisper of the wind. God is found in the silence. But that doesn't energize Elijah to hear God in the silence. Elijah feels unworthy and covers his face and goes into isolation once more. And I'm not saying that's good or that's bad, but I often feel that way. I've felt that way my whole life. That no matter what happens, no matter how many blessings God gives me, no matter how many times God shows his face, and I find myself retreating into isolation because I just feel unworthy to God. I feel inadequate. And it's like, well, why do you feel inadequate? To be inadequate is not good enough. What do you mean? Why are you not good enough? And it's not a abstract. We think of emotions, especially negative emotions, as brain chemicals and chemicals in our mind, but it's not an abstract reason as to why I feel inadequate and not good enough. We all know, we all see everything that we do all of the time. We see our triumphs and our downfalls and the blessings that we have in our life, and I see all of the abundance of blessings that God has given me. The blessings that God has given me are beyond belief, but I'm consistently not a good steward of those blessings. I don't handle those blessings in the best way. I find myself constantly falling. And So it's interesting that God, his voice is in the gentle whisper of the wind, and Elijah would cover his face, because that's how I feel often. That God continuously rescues me. God continuously reveals himself to me and gives me comfort when I'm mourning, and gives me blessings beyond belief. But I continuously fall short, and I'm not a good steward of those blessings. And I don't literally cover my face, but I go into isolation because I don't know what else to do. I just often feel not good enough. And I've come to see something with this lately, though. And I don't quite know what to do with this information relative to this problem of not feeling good enough, which is the other day I was writing, and but I don't consider myself a writer. I literally put words on a page, and I like to write, but I don't consider myself a writer. And so I was writing the other morning, and I was like, I'm not a writer, so what am I? What am I even doing while I'm putting words onto a page? I don't care about proper grammar. What I'm trying to do is convey something, convey honesty, convey truth. I'm trying to create. But it would be grandiose to call myself a poet. I'm not a poet. I certainly don't write poems often. So what am I? And I'm a child of God, yes, but I looked up the definition of, I was like, well, what is poetry? It's grandiose to call yourself a poet, yes, but what is poetry? And poetry comes from the Greek word poiesis. And poiesis literally means bringing something out of nothing, creating. There's nothing, and then you bring something to fruition. And there's a word that is the contrast to that word, which kind of fried my brain when I realized that this was the contrast to that word, which is praxis. And the English version of these word, or this word, is things like practical, pragmatism, practice. So poiesis and practice, or praxis. And praxis means I could describe it as regarding life being a journey. Praxis is like when people say life is a journey, but it's not about the destination, it's about the journey itself. It's about living in the present moment. So poiesis is bringing something that isn't here to fruition, but that thing that isn't here, because it isn't here, you have to have a relationship with the future. And praxis is living in the present moment. And so I've always wondered, well, what should I do then? Like, how could I create? And I mean that internally and externally. How can I create? How can I become who I'm meant to be? And how can I bring external things to fruition as well? Should I be in a state of poiesis or praxis? And relative to poiesis, poetry, you can bring things to fruition that are very clearly visible. You can be in a state of poiesis relative to wealth, and you have no money right now, and you can bring wealth to fruition. And that would be poiesis, attention, fame. You've got no attention or fame right now. And then you garner attention and fame for yourself, and you bring what you had was nothing. You bring something to fruition. And we often, especially the world today, that is what a lot of corporations and businesses focus on. Rather than beauty and bringing something divine to fruition, focusing on God and your poiesis being aiming for the kingdom of God, rather than that happening, we try to bring worldly things that we ourselves can imagine to fruition. And then we live in the praxis of that. That is the present moment of which we live in. But in understanding these two words, I've realized that you actually need to be in a state of both. You've got to be at the cross of being and becoming. that is living on the edge. You've got to be at the cross of poiesis and praxis. And part of the reason why I bring up this specific aspect of the story of Elijah is because what is the poiesis that we should aim for? Like, what is the beauty that we should aim for? And Michelangelo, relative to this as well, Michelangelo had a pretty amazing quote where he's the one that created La Pieta, which is Mary holding the body of Jesus Christ, the sculpture of Mary holding Jesus's body after the crucifixion. And relative to that sculpture, he was quoted saying, "I saw an angel in the stone, and I had to free it. I saw an angel in the stone, and I wanted to set that angel free." And I think that perfectly represents this place of being and becoming, that in order to create what is truly good, you aim for the kingdom of God. You are like Elijah. Just doesn't really matter what the whole world is doing. The whole world is worshiping false idols and false prophets, and he is alone with God. You're alone with God, and you have faith in God, and God grants you the ability to see what is ineffable, what words can't describe, what is currently unseen, the angel that is in the stone. And so my point with all of that is we live in a realm where no matter if you want to or not, we're always becoming. We are being, but we're always becoming. We're always changing. The world is always changing around us. We are always changing. And so, yes, we are being, but because we're always becoming, there's an implication that if you are growing, in the past, you were less than what you are right now. You've become a better man today than you were yesterday. And if you're a better man today than you were yesterday, and you're going to be a better man tomorrow than you are today, that means you are inherently inadequate. And that doesn't mean you're not good enough for the day, but you are inherently less than what you could possibly be. And to go back to the point that I was making of Elijah being out on the cliff and the angel saying, "Go stand on the cliff, the Lord is about to pass by." I've questioned often why Elijah has such favor with God. It is so beautiful, and it's not concerning or disturbing at all. It's incredibly beautiful, but it's still hard to understand because Elijah has traits where he's constantly going into isolation and desolation and constantly afraid, but God is pazza d'amore. God has a crazy love for Elijah. Towards Elijah, he is this way towards all of us. God is this way towards all of us. But Elijah is the one sheep out of the 99 that God will leave the 99 sheep and go save the one. He shows incredible favor to Elijah, and I'm like, well, why does he show that favor? When Elijah goes out into the cliff and watches the Lord pass by, watches God pass by, and God is in the whisper of the wind, it's somewhat ineffable to describe the mercy of God coming down in the form of Jesus Christ, meaning God being a baby, being born as a baby, the complete innocence, complete vulnerability, and giving himself up for the love of you, letting himself walk into death, letting himself walk into persecution and torture, getting beat. And so when Elijah goes to the cliff and he witnesses God passing by, he is witnessing Jesus Christ pass by in the whisper of the wind, gentle whisper. And it's like, no matter how bad life gets, no matter how much the world is against you and persecutes you and tries to bring you down into misery, you can have comfort in knowing that God did that to the greatest extent. God came down from heaven, showed us the way, and he is walking the path with you, no matter how desolate you become. And Elijah, the transfiguration. Elijah, there's a scene before Jesus goes into the passion, goes into the crucifixion, that he goes up to the top of a mountain and he brings 3 of his disciples with him, and he transfigures into his true form. And when he transfigures into his true form, he makes his full divinity is there, but he makes his full divinity known to his 3 disciples, and Elijah is with him at the transfiguration. Elijah and Moses. Moses is the law, Elijah is the prophet. And so Elijah, after he watched God pass by from that cliff, even then, once again, he had a cross to carry. God kept trying to encourage him onward, and he went into isolation once more. And God gave him an incredible mercy. God said, all right, go to Israel, appoint this person king. Go to Elisha is going to be the person who takes over for you as prophet. And so from the context, it seems like Elijah's job isn't finished. Elijah's journey is not completely finished. But because he just, the cross that Elijah is carrying him, the burden that Elijah is carrying is crushing him. And out of mercy and love, God gives him relinquishment from the cross. God doesn't make him continue onward. And Elijah is one of two of the people in the entire Bible who never dies. After he appoints Elisha as the prophet that will take over, he gives Elisha his spirit. And God sends a chariot down of fire and takes Elijah back up with him takes Elijah to heaven, and Elijah doesn't even have to experience death. Blessed are those who mourn. Elijah's mourning for the entire world because they've turned away from God. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. Elijah is pure in heart, and he is at the transfiguration of Jesus Christ. And the reason why I bring up the transfiguration of Jesus is because in regards to this problem, not a problem, but a reality that is a cross that is hard to bear, of both being and becoming. Elijah goes to the center of the cross, where being meets becoming, where they are the same thing. Jesus Christ is, in that moment, certainly is no longer being and becoming. He is both at the exact same time. And in the mercy that God gives Elijah is one of the people who is at that place. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. Elijah is pure in heart, and we talk about emotions, and we think of emotions as chemicals in the brain. But when you are in that flow state of being and becoming, when you are probably through the mercy of God, perfectly oriented towards God, when being meets becoming, and you find yourself fully engrossed in the present moment, and you are what we call happiness. It's more than just chemicals in the brain. You can reach a point in this life that it's not enough to say that everything is okay. Everything is divine. The veil is removed. You see the light of God in a way that you couldn't before fathom, and things are good. Things are good. And my laptop has died along with the blue chair. I've lost everything. I'm still losing things, but that is okay. And so I've got a time limit for this video. So I'll leave you with this. Elijah is the person who comes at the end of times. Elijah is the person who ushers in the second coming of Christ. Before Christ comes again, Elijah is the person who comes back and tells people to turn back to God. And so even right now in this moment, Elijah's journey is not over. Despite how desolate he became, his journey is not over. And no matter how desolate we become, our journey is not over either. And that isn't all that I have, but that's all that I have for now. Goodbye.